Welcome to this edition of the weekly dialogues under Jaipur Dialogues. Today I have Sandeep Balakrishna of Dharma Dispatch with me, author and writer, and his book 70 Years of Secularism has made a lot of waves, and also his translation of Avran, and is also known for his best-selling Tipu Sultan, the Tyrant of Mysore. How are you, Sandeep?
I'm good, Sanjay ji. How are you? How was the lockdown treating you?
But also, and today I propose to talk to
Hmm.
you about Savarkar. Only yesterday I saw a beautiful piece on Savarkar from you.
Thank you.
So, how would you describe Savarkar if you have to describe him in a nutshell?
Hmm. Well, since you quoted my piece that I wrote yesterday, the very last sentence of that piece basically uh, gives, my description, or generally speaking, how any Indian should view Veer Savarkar uh, as either akin to the Hindu Mahasagar or the Indian Ocean, or akin to the Himalaya mountains. What is your first response when you are confronted with the majesty and the grandeur of Himalaya? It is silence, it is beyond words. So when you regard Veer Savarkar's entire legacy, at least to my mind, that is the closest analogy that I can give. Because what other people will take perhaps 5 or 6 lifetimes to accomplish, he has accomplished in less than one lifetime at enormous cost, and most notably with absolutely no bitterness from when he started his revolutionary work, his struggle, his role in the freedom movement, right till the day he passed away. So that is ideally how all Indians should regard Vinayak Damodar Savarkar.
There is a feeling that
Mhm.
Vinayak Damodar Savarkar probably spent his best years in
Mhm.
the prison, and
Mhm.
that was the time when his genius should have flowered.
Mhm.
And also, we also have this instance, in fact, one of the probably only instance in the history of book writing and book publishing, that his book that was written in Marathi, The First War of Independence, was
Mhm.
actually banned even before it was published.
Yes.
And I have read that book, and you have read that book. In what manner did
Mhm.
that book particularly enthuse and made the entire revolutionary movement impassioned?
Okay, I'll answer this question in a slightly separate way. And it's wonderful that you brought in his book on the First War of Independence, 1857, as a good way to segue in a more detailed fashion into our discussion today. Is the fact that he was perhaps the first setter of original narratives. That book itself, especially the title, calling 1857 as the first war of independence, was a supreme, extraordinary act of setting a cultural and civilizational narrative. I mean, after that, until then, even Indians were calling this as a sepoy mutiny. It was a term that the British gave us. That the British were not benevolent by any standards.
Right,
I
right.
mean, how they put down 1857, the War of Independence, I mean, it was brutal, it was savage. So, and they called it, how do they, kind of dilute their savagery? They call it a mutiny. They don't even call it a revolt,
Right.
right? So, he turned it over its head and called it with its proper name, the First War of Indian Independence. Although, at a scholarly and, if you want to pick gray, some bones with it, hair splitting kind of analysis, you can still say, you can still fall back on what R.C. Majumdar said, that in 1857 or 1858, India merely changed masters. So India lost her independence 500 years before that, And in 1857, she merely changed masters. So if you want to really pick a bone with Veer Savarkar, you can say that, that was not the first war of Indian independence, but the second war of Indian independence, strictly speaking.
Okay.
Right, strictly speaking. But I mean, like all of us are products of our times, he was also a product of his time. And more importantly, he saw, the overthrow of British rule was paramount in his mind. So he said, no, it was not a mutiny. It was the first war of Indian independence. And after that, I mean, that one word sent shock waves and, waves of a lot of inspiration throughout the community of Indian freedom fighters. They said, yes, what a seminal book. And one thing led to the other. And before long, he became one of the blazing stars of the freedom movement. Does it answer your question?
Yeah. So that was very well put. Also, he was a setter of narratives in many ways. And First War of Independence was only one of the things that he did. And even later on, there were many things that he set the narratives. And for the first time, for instance, after he was released, I think he was the first person who started the movement against untouchability. That's not well known to most people. In fact, that happened even before Gandhi or Ambedkar started that movement. Probably he was the trendsetter and he was probably the original reformer.
Absolutely. So apart from untouchability, what he also did was what is known as this later, laws were enacted to allow the so-called lower classes, castes to enter temples, right? The seed was sown by Savarkar, and not too many people know that Veer Savarkar was a first-rate scholar. He was a very, very learned man. And he had devoured all of world history, especially Indian history, from the earliest times till his own time. As a very perceptive, very learned man. He was not just someone who just made bombs and jumped off, from a ship and escaped the British, from when the ship was going on, taking him from France and all that. He made a daring escape. Yes, all that is all there. But from where did he get that strength? A lot of people also, his junior contemporaries like Bhagat Singh, all these guys pretty much did the same, acts of courage and all that. But without taking away from their legacy, you must understand where this conviction comes from. It comes from deep learning and deep meditation. It was not just, I'll throw a few bombs and, raise a private army and throw out the British. No, it was not. The impetus came from his learning and meditations. Most people forget it. And his very overlooked other book, apart from the War of Independence, is this, I'm sure you've read it, enormously influential, very well written book called Six Glorious Epochs of Hindu History or Indian History. Extraordinary book. Even today, it is the gold standard in many ways. And, he names it as such. Which are these six epochs? People should read such books. I mean, you can't separate 1857 book from Six Glorious Epochs and his writings on Hindutva. These are all, you might argue with, like I said, some finer points. But the fact that he has given us these finer points, what does it show? He was a first-rate intellect.
You're absolutely right. He was a first-rate intellectual. And I have read, or rather, I am in the process of reading that Six Glorious Epochs of Indian history. And today, as you said, it is the gold standard, and we often refer back to those era which are not referred to and which have been practically whitewashed by these Marxist historians. Also, if you look at his activities in Ratnagiri, where he was confined for 13 years after he was released from incarceration, even that period is very productive. And productive not just in the field of social reform. Yes, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. Before I forget, even in Andaman Cellular Jail, he did not spend a single minute of idle time. He did not waste it. He wrote on the walls. This, in spite of after undergoing some seriously savage torture. hours together, no place to defecate or do your regular routine. Any other person would have either gone mad or killed himself. This man wrote on the walls, sat and meditated, chanted.
I know, and
Yeah.
not just wrote on the walls. He in fact composed poetries through
There
memory,
you go.
and,
Yeah, wrote memory, yes.
and was able to, after 10 years of incarceration, when he came out and came back to India, he was able to recall that poetry and put it down on paper. So that's sort of a phenomenal intellect that he had. So I was asking, before we diverted to the Andaman days of Veer Savarkar, I was asking about the days that he spent in Ratnagiri, which were very productive in the sense that not just the social reform, not just the movement against untouchability, not just the temple movement, all of which were copied later by others without giving him credit. He also inspired a lot of revolutionaries who used to come and visit him. And in fact, the British were always apprehensive of his activities, and he was even warned a couple of times that that would lead him back to the prison. But all those 13 years were very, very gainfully utilized. Can you throw some more light on the activities that he did in Ratnagiri in that 13-year period till 1937?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Savarkar was in those years, I can just give a brief picture of that, under broad categories. One is this temple entry, the thing of untouchability, and marrying of Hindu girls, pre-puberty Hindu girls, and the importance of giving them a proper education and life skills, so that during those troubling times they could stand on their own feet and then carry on a family or carry on with their lives. That is then the other one. And not too many people know that he was in constant touch with various ashrams. Now Ratnagiri and that entire coastal belt, for example, Devgarh and other places in that coastal belt, he was in touch with various Hindu mutts and ashrams and coaxing them to kind of lend him a hand and further his Hindu social reform activities. And he met with quite a bit of resistance, but he also met with a great amount of support from individual Hindu scholars and some mutts who were sympathetic to his cause, because one thing is undeniable with Savarkar is the sheer force of his personality. You spoke to him for 5 minutes, you would be a convert. And extremely dynamic, extremely in your face, bold, courageous, all adjectives, whatever you want to use for him, he was all that. What most people also don't know, that he was in regular correspondence with people like P.V. Kane.
Yes.
All the top scholars in Maharashtra, across India actually. He was in constant correspondence, and you can check out P.V. Kane's writings. He holds Veer Savarkar on a pedestal. Not just that. I mean, Lata Mangeshkar, why do all these people revere him as God even today? She gets emotional on so many occasions. Why? Because of the work he did there.
Yes,
The
definitely.
kind of legacy he left behind.
He was very well rooted in Dharma Shastras, and
Absolutely.
Outwardly he would go against the ritualistic part. He would be he would rebel against orthodoxies, and he would carry out many reform movements which are not very palatable to the orthodox sections of the Indian society. But his constant companion was Bhagavad Gita.
Correct. No, well, okay. I'll just kind of throw more light on that. Point is, the orthodoxy that you're referring, or what he kind of criticized, he didn't fight against them. He was an informed critique of those orthodoxies, because like I said, he's a product of his time. So because he saw that these in the name of these rituals and orthodoxies, the entire Hindu Samaj was getting damaged. that, you're caught in these little islands of your own, making, whatever name you give it. Okay. And little by little, it is chipping away at the roots of your entire Hindu society, which is what he was against.
Right. And not just that, he was also a very practical politician and strategist. I have,
Totally.
in fact, my book on 370 and CAA is now almost into print. And in that book, I have taken the background. The entire pre-partition politics is the background of that book. And one thing that stands out in that pre-partition politics is that Savarkar was the one man who could see what was coming. And seeing what was coming, he was the one person who criticized the Congress for deserting, or rather abdicating their responsibility, resigning the ministries, and leaving the field open for the Muslim League. And
Yes.
after that, he was the one person who actively, very actively, campaigned for Hindu youths to get into the British Army. And even when he was called by the Viceroy, he told him very clearly that I would assist you because I want my youth to be militarily trained, because that
Yes.
helps
Yes.
the cause of my revolution. So he was
Yes.
he was that clear. And
Yeah.
my analysis is, and Dr. Ambedkar in his book Pakistan or the Partition of India has done a detailed analysis as to why partition became inevitable. And one of the things that he said the partition became inevitable was because of the army situation. 33% of the army was Muslim.
Muslim. Yes.
And if Savarkar had not consciously campaigned for and managed to get Hindu youths recruited, the situation at the time of the Second World War would have been that more than 50% of the army would have been Muslim. And in that
Muslim.
situation, probably we would have lost the whole of Bengal and whole of Punjab, and not just got the partition of Punjab and Bengal.
Absolutely. Actually, it's a good point you mentioned about, Hinduizing the army, or, encouraging Hindu youths to join the Indian Army, British Indian Army at any rate. Was that in 1943, Savarkar, I think, he makes a resignation speech in which he quotes the moderates, that is the Congress, so-called moderates in the Congress party. This is pre-Gandhian Congress, right? So he says that even they had more spine than these guys. That, they wanted a repeal of the British bill, which basically, wanted to weaken the Hindu martial spirit. He campaigned for that, and he said, these moderates had even more spine than this Gandhian Congress. And he said, in 1943, he expresses satisfaction that the militarization of Hindu Mahasabha, or Hindu youths at any rate, was at its peak. Unless we understand this, this is on one side. Then we had Subhash Bose's INA on the other side. Then on yet another side, as like a organically orchestrated culmination, you had the final nail in the coffin in the form of the Bombay Naval Mutiny. So everybody, most writers forget this fact, because the militarization of Hindu youth and Savarkar's Hindu Mahasabha was at its peak in those days. So it was obviously seen as a great threat by the Congress, right? Congress saw him as their sworn enemy. So that's why I always have a line, and I'm going to say this. Any Indian who criticizes Savarkar is by default a supporter of three imperialisms. First imperialism is a British imperialism. Second is the residual imperialism of the medieval Muslim tyranny. The third imperialism is a combined imperialism of Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. This man stood in the center of this Chakravyuha and fought single-handedly all these three imperialisms. This is why he is hated so much. And anybody who criticizes Savarkar, it is one thing to argue with his ideas. What is the criticism, so-called criticism of Savarkar from the last 70, 80 years based on? What is it? It is pure personal slander. How many of these, his so-called critics, how many have read beyond, even 50 pages of his entire corpus of writing and speeches?
Oh, no way. 50 pages is too much. All they read is Shashi Tharoor.
And my favorite, Ram Guha.
And Ramchandra Guha, of course.
And Ram Guha.
They are both my favorites also.
So that
I
is
keep
one.
asking them questions they have never answered.
No, yeah, even I mean, I share the same unfortunate dishonor, but okay. So, so the other thing is that Savarkar cannot be seen in isolation. He has to be contrasted with two other people. One is Gandhi, the other is Jinnah. We all know his views about both Gandhi and Jinnah, but Savarkar can't be seen in isolation. You can't separate Savarkar from Jinnah and Gandhi. Towards the end, as the freedom was, we were more or less sure that we would get freedom. Who went down on his knees before Jinnah? Who capitulated? Gandhi and the Congress he had created.
Oh yes, that happened. In fact, I think the Congress lost its nerve after the great Calcutta killings. That was the time that they lost their nerve.
They lost their nerve because their nerves were broken long back. No, when this man took over, when he preached non-violence cowardice.
That was what, again, I have referred to this in my book, and that I borrowed from Dr. Ambedkar again. And Dr. Ambedkar said that even before 1945, he said that Congress doesn't seem to know the difference between appeasement and settlement.
Correct.
And it was so abject that in 1942 itself, Chakravarti Rajgopalachari had gone on record and supported the demand for Pakistan. So it was always there. It was always there in the works. The only thing is that somebody needed to get up and call this bluff. If this bluff had been called, then there would probably have been much less bloodshed. After all, if you fear civil war, there is no way you can prevent it.
No, you can't. You can't. It's that genie in the bottle that you should never let out. Once you leave it out, there's no telling where it will end or how it will end. As simple as that. Right. Next question.
Only when we are prepared to fight a civil war, would you be able to avert a civil war? And anybody with any brains, I refer to Dr. Ambedkar twice or thrice. Once again, he's again on this, that you have to be prepared. If you're not prepared and you're caught unprepared, then you have no other way except to capitulate and settle on the terms of your enemy. And
absolutely,
Jinnah was veritably the enemy at that time, and he had smelled the blood. As soon as he carried out that great massacre of 16th August 1946,
Calcutta killing
that he saw, he knew that these people
not came over. So that's pretty much how it is. And look, I mean, you got Ambedkar, which is fine, but it seems to me today that except for Gandhi and his coterie, his gang, everybody knew the writing on the wall, what these guys were capable of and what they were up to. Ambedkar, R.C. Majumdar, he might have written the history after we got independence, but he was also an eyewitness and a participant in that movement, in that era. R.C. Majumdar, Jadunath Sarkar, all of these people. I think Jadunath Sarkar's own son-in-law was killed in Calcutta in that Savarkar's thing. Sarkar, all these people, Savarkar, Veer Savarkar. And he was the most trenchant critic of Gandhi from day one. He said, this man will lead this country to ruin. And he will lead Hindus to ruin. I mean, his sarcasm is just amazing. Savarkar's sarcasm is amazing. He said, this guy goes to, Mr. Gandhi goes to London for the second roundtable conference, and on the problem of all these Pathans, fanatic Pathans in Afghanistan, burning down Hindu homes, carrying off the women, looting and killing Hindus. What is the solution that Gandhi gives in London in front of the British PM? I forget who the PM was. I think Churchill or somebody. I'm not sure. Second roundtable conference, whoever it was. Yeah. So he tells there that the solution to this problem is that Hindus should be like me and should spin charaka, and by the very act of that penance, the radiation, what is that? Some word he uses, that spiritual radiation or something, will touch the hearts of these Pathans and make them soften their thing and lay down their arms or some shit like that. Sorry for the invective, but I mean, he says this in an international forum. And this man is a representative of our freedom struggle, really? And so Savarkar says, why stop at spinning wheels? Why don't you send beautiful Hindu damsels as a garrison instead of soldiers? You send beautiful Hindu girls at the frontier and make them spin charaka and charm them into non-violence. This is what Savarkar writes.
Anyway, I have my own views about ahimsa and ahimsa paramo dharma, which I have in fact spoken out.
Dharma himsa tataivacha.
Sorry?
Dharma himsa tataivacha.
Anyway, that is Swami Chinmayanand's take. That's not supported by any scriptures. But I have my own views. If you watch my videos, then you would have seen it. That because it is very much there in Gita, and the hinsa and ahimsa belongs to the manas and to chit, and not in your action. Ultimately, yassina hankrito bhavam. Buddhir yassana lipyate. So if you not have that,
Bhagavad Gita itself is an exhortation to dharma yuddha. You don't fight yuddha by chanting mantras. No?
Naturally,
you have to pick up weapons.
So that particular interpretation of Gita was definitely perverse. But I think we are diverting a little. We are
diverting a lot actually. Coming back to Savarkar.
Somebody else. Let's stick to Savarkar. Now, the final phase of Savarkar's life. How do you see that final phase of Savarkar's life post-independence? Of course, actually, he was not keeping well. He was not keeping well. But he was still able to inspire a lot many people.
Okay, so I think that is one of the greatest tragedies that, a person who has dedicated his entire life to the Hindu cause, to serve this beloved Bharatavarsha, he loved so much, and he fought, the amount of inhuman torture that he has undergone is simply unparalleled by any other freedom fighter, with due respect to their contribution. But what does he get in an independent India? What does he get for all these sacrifices? What does he get? He gets branded as a murderer and gets arrested and is put on trial.
Is put on trial.
Put on trial for Gandhi's murder, for telling the truth. He was a far more truthful and a far more non-violent man in spirit, by nature, in temperament. He was a far more truthful and non-violent man than the so-called apostle of Satya and Ahimsa, for whose murder he was unfairly put on trial.
That discussion we'll keep to some other day.
But anyway, so because you asked, so because you asked, my thing on his final days. So, he was hounded in independent India by people who ideally should have put him, on a pedestal and worshipped him. Instead, they put him on the trial, and they would have been very happy if the judges sentenced him. Believe me.
I know those kind of stories are planted even today.
Yeah.
That there were certain evidences that were not taken into account. In fact, I read it only I think a couple of years.
Yeah. So those frontline maybe must be in frontline.
So would it be right, Deep? Let me ask you the final question. would you consider that we look at Savarkar's life as a Jnana Yogi and as a Karma Yogi, and in contradistinction to what is called a ritualistic orthodox Sanatani?
I wouldn't call him exactly a Jnana Yogi, because that connotation of a true Jnana Yogi is completely different. What we can call him is definitely a Karma Yogi, plus he was a Dharma Yogi. He fought for the unity, integrity of this civilization. He didn't see this as simply a nation state, although he's written something to that effect. But there's a lot of other stuff also that he's written, which can definitely qualify him for calling him a Karma Yogi and a Dharma Yogi, because he fought for Sanatana Dharma in almost all its social and civilizational manifestations, to preserve that, to continue it, to perpetuate it in the future. That, I think, can be his legacy, which is why, I compare him with the Himalayas or the Indian Ocean. One for its sheer scale, the other for its sheer expanse, its vastness, which is infinite. So this is kind of his legacy, if you want to put it in one line.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. It's been very enlightening talking to you, and we hope to have you many more times on many more occasions on the Jaipur Dialogues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.